Hello everyone, and welcome to Whispering Woods. I'm here to help you unwind tonight to slow your breathing, clear your thoughts, and drift into calm. Find a comfortable place, let the world outside fade, and just listen. Before we begin, if stories like this help you find a little peace at the end of the day, feel free to like this video and subscribe to Whispering Woods. It lets these quiet tales keep finding the ones who need them. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? The rain has just begun to fall, soft and steady, the kind that whispers against window panes and turns the world silver. Somewhere between evening and true night, the sky holds that particular shade of blue that feels like memory itself, deep and endless, punctuated by the first uncertain stars. The air carries the scent of wet earth and distant pine, and if you listen closely, beneath the rain's gentle rhythm, you can almost hear the day releasing its hold, letting everything settle into the softer territories of dusk. There was a bookshop once, tucked between a bakery and a clockmaker's shop on a street that curved like a question mark through the oldest part of town. Not many people remembered it was there, the kind of place you could walk past 100 times before you finally noticed the narrow door, the faded gold lettering on the window that read Threshold Books, and the warm light that seemed to glow from within at all hours, regardless of whether the shop was actually open. Margaret found it on a Tuesday in October, though she couldn't have told you why she pushed open that particular door on that particular afternoon. Perhaps it was the way the light fell across the threshold, or the sudden memory of her grandmother's hands turning the pages of a book when Margaret was small, or simply the feeling that sometimes overtakes a person on autumn days when the world seems thin and dreamlike, as if reality itself is holding its breath. The bell above the door made no sound when she entered, but she felt its presence, somehow a shift in the air, a gentle acknowledgement. The shop was exactly the size it needed to be, which is to say, it seemed to expand and contract depending on where you looked. Shelves climbed toward a ceiling that appeared both close and impossibly far away, and the books themselves were arranged according to some logic that had nothing to do with alphabet or genre, and everything to do with the way certain stories need to sit beside certain other stories, keeping each other company in the quiet hours. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," said a voice, and Margaret turned to find an elderly woman emerging from between two shelves. She wore a cardigan the color of October twilight and reading glasses on a silver chain, and her smile was the kind that makes you feel as though you've been expected, though you've never met before. "I'm not sure I meant to arrive at all," Margaret admitted, and it was true. She'd been walking without destination, following the cooling day wherever it led. "The best arrivals are accidental," the woman said, and introduced herself as Eleanor, keeper of this particular threshold. "The books that find us are rarely the ones we set out looking for. Would you like some tea? I've just put the kettle on, and there's something about rain that makes tea taste like memory." They sat in two chairs that must have always been there, near a window that looked out onto the rain-softened street. The tea was the color of amber and tasted faintly of bergamot, and something else Margaret couldn't name, perhaps patience, or the particular flavor of autumn afternoons when time moves like honey. "Tell me," Eleanor said, settling into her chair with the ease of someone who has sat in this same spot for countless evenings, "what brings you through the threshold today? Not just your feet, but the part of you that's been looking for something you haven't quite named yet." Margaret considered this, watching the rain trace silver paths down the window. "I think I'm looking for a story I used to know," she said slowly. One my grandmother told me when I was young about a garden that existed between seasons, where autumn and winter met and made something beautiful out of their meeting. I've been trying to remember how it ended, but the memory keeps slipping away, like trying to hold water in your hands. Eleanor nodded, her eyes gentle behind her glasses. The stories we lose are often the ones we need most to find again. They don't disappear, they simply step into the spaces between things, waiting for the right moment to return. Your grandmother's story about the seasonal garden, I believe I know the one you mean. Or, rather, I know where to find it. She rose and moved between the shelves with the quiet grace of someone reading their way through a familiar text. Margaret followed, her footsteps soft on the worn wooden floor. The books around them seemed to lean in, curious, their spines catching the lamplight in shades of burgundy and forest green, midnight blue, and the pale gold of morning. "Here," Eleanor said, running her finger along a shelf that held volumes with no titles on their spines. "These are the books that contain stories not quite written, or written so long ago that they've become something else, memories disguised as narratives, dreams that learned to hold still long enough to be caught in words." She pulled out a slim volume bound in cloth the color of November mist. The pages, when she opened them, were covered in handwriting that seemed to shift and settle as Margaret watched, as though the story itself was still deciding how it wanted to be told. "This garden," Eleanor began, and her voice took on the quality of reading aloud, though she wasn't looking at the pages, "existed in the space where autumn's last warmth met winter's first frost. It wasn't a place you could find on any map because it moved, with the seasons themselves appearing and disappearing like breath on a cold window pane. The garden's keeper was neither young nor old, but something in between the age that people become when they've learned to be content with questions that have no answers." Margaret found herself settling against the bookshelf, the volume open in Eleanor's hands, the rain continuing its soft percussion against the windows. She was 7 years old again, sitting at her grandmother's feet, while the old woman's voice wove worlds out of evening air. The keeper tended plants that grew only in that liminal space. Eleanor continued, her voice steady and warm as lamplight. Frost flowers that bloomed in crystalline spirals, their petals made of ice that never melted. Trees that held both autumn's last leaves and winter's first snow on the same branches, creating a canopy of gold and white that whispered when the wind moved through it. And at the garden's heart grew the threshold rose a flower that was always in the process of blooming and never quite finished, eternally becoming itself. The story unfolded like a long exhale, each sentence leading naturally to the next. Margaret felt her shoulders relaxing, the tension she'd been carrying for weeks, months, slowly releasing its grip. The bookshop around them seemed to grow quieter, more present, as though the other books were listening too. Eleanor told of how the garden's keeper welcomed visitors who arrived by accident or instinct. Those who were between things themselves, between jobs, between relationships, between versions of themselves. They would spend a season there, sometimes longer, learning the particular wisdom that comes from tending things that exist in the spaces between what is and what is becoming. "There was a woman once," Eleanor said, turning a page, though Margaret suspected the words weren't actually written there, "who came to the garden having lost her sense of direction. Not in the physical sense, she could still read maps and find her way through streets, but in the deeper sense of not knowing which version of her life to choose, which path to take when all paths seemed equally possible and equally impossible. The keeper had set her to work with the frost flowers, teaching her to tend blooms that were simultaneously fragile and enduring, that could only exist by embracing contradiction. Every morning, the woman would water them with dew collected from the threshold between night and day. Every evening, she would sing to them songs that were half remembered and half invented, melodies that existed nowhere else. Margaret realized she was breathing more slowly now, each breath synchronized with the rhythm of Eleanor's words. The tea had grown cold in her cup, but its warmth remained somehow, a remembered comfort. Over time, Eleanor said, the woman learned that direction isn't always about choosing a single path. Sometimes it's about understanding that you can hold multiple possibilities at once. The way the garden held both autumn and winter, the way the threshold rose held both bloom and bud. When she finally left the garden, and everyone eventually leaves, because that's the nature of thresholds, to be passed through rather than stayed in, she carried with her the knowledge that she could be both certain and uncertain, both rooted and free. If stories like this calm your thoughts, you're home here in Whispering Woods. The story wound on, through seasons within seasons, through the various visitors who came and went, each learning something different from the same garden. Eleanor's voice never wavered, never rushed, allowing each image to settle fully before moving to the next. Outside, the rain intensified slightly, then softened again, a natural accompaniment to the narrative. Margaret found herself remembering not just her grandmother's original story, but the feeling of being young and held safe, of believing that the world contained more magic than disappointment, more possibility than loss. The memory was bittersweet but not painful, more like the taste of honey with a hint of lemon, complex and real. The garden still exists, Eleanor said, bringing the story toward its gentle conclusion. It moves with the seasons, appearing wherever autumn and winter meet, wherever any two things create a threshold by their meeting. Some say you can find it if you look for it on certain October evenings when the air holds both warmth and cold, or on November mornings when frost and sunlight share the ground. But, most often, it finds you when you're ready to learn what it teaches, that the spaces between things are not empty, but full of their own particular magic. She closed the book, though Margaret had the sense that the story continued somewhere, in some other form, perhaps in the rain itself, or in the growing darkness outside, or in the space between her own heartbeats. "Thank you," Margaret said, and the words felt insufficient but true. "That was. I remembered it, but also it was new. How is that possible?" Eleanor smiled, setting the book back in its place on the shelf. The best stories are like that, familiar and fresh at once. They grow with us, revealing new layers each time we return to them. Your grandmother's version was the one you needed as a child. This version is the one you need now. And if you find the story again in another 10 years, it will have changed again, or you will have, which amounts to the same thing. They returned to their chairs by the window. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, no longer falling but simply existing, a constant presence like breath or heartbeat. Margaret realized she had no idea how long she'd been in the bookshop. It could have been an hour or several, or no time at all in the usual sense. "Do you have a story?" Eleanor asked, pouring more tea from a pot that somehow remained hot. Everyone who comes through that door carries stories, even if they don't think of themselves as storytellers. The threshold recognizes them. Margaret laughed softly. Nothing as beautiful as a garden between seasons. My life is fairly ordinary work and routine, and the same streets walked the same way every day. Ordinary lives are often the richest in stories, Eleanor said. They're just quieter, easier to overlook. But they're there, in the details. The way light falls through your kitchen window at a certain hour. The regular who always orders the same coffee at the same time. The tree you pass every day and notice changing with the seasons. Those small observations, those quiet noticings, they're the material of stories, if you let them be. They talked as the afternoon deepened into evening, as the rain continued its patient work of washing the world clean. Eleanor shared stories of other visitors to the bookshop, other people who'd pushed open that narrow door looking for something they couldn't quite name. There was the man who'd come seeking a book about loss and left with one about transformation. The child who'd wanted adventure stories and discovered instead a book of silences, which taught her that the spaces between words were as important as the words themselves. The shop has been here a long time, Eleanor said, gazing out at the street where lights were beginning to come on in windows, small squares of gold appearing in the gathering dusk. Longer than I've been its keeper, certainly. It was here before the bakery and the clockmaker's shop, and it will be here after. Some places exist outside of time, in that way not immortal. Exactly, but patient, waiting for the people who need to find them. Margaret felt a question forming, one she wasn't sure she wanted to ask. Will I be able to find it again? The shop, I mean. Or will it be one of those places that only appears once? Eleanor's smile was gentle, understanding. That depends on what you need. Some people come once and never return. Because once was enough, they found what they were looking for, or it found them. Others come back again and again, because they're the kind of people who require multiple thresholds, multiple between places. The shop will be here if you need it to be. And if you can't find it, that probably means you don't need it anymore, which is its own kind of gift. The evening had arrived fully now, that particular darkness that feels soft rather than threatening, the kind that invites rest rather than weariness. Margaret realized she should probably go. She had work in the morning, responsibilities, the ordinary architecture of life, but she was reluctant to leave this warm, book-filled space where time moved differently and stories lived in the margins. Before you go, Eleanor said, as if reading her thoughts, take this. She pressed something into Margaret's hand, a small, smooth stone, dark gray with a single vein of white quartz running through it. A threshold stone. Keep it in your pocket. On days when everything feels too solid, too fixed, too certain, hold it. It will remind you that there are always spaces between things, always possibilities you haven't considered. Margaret closed her fingers around the stone. It was warm from Eleanor's hand, or perhaps from wherever it had been kept, and it fit perfectly in her palm, as if it had been waiting there all along. Thank you, she said again, and this time the words felt more adequate, more full of what she actually meant. Thank you for finding your way here, Eleanor replied, standing to walk Margaret to the door. Safe travels through all your thresholds. The bell still made no sound as Margaret left, but she felt its blessing somehow, a gentle acknowledgement of leaving. The rain had stopped, leaving the street washed and gleaming, and the air smelled of wet pavement and approaching winter. She walked slowly, not quite ready to return, to her apartment, to her regular life, wanting to hold on to the bookshop's atmosphere a little longer. As she turned the corner, she glanced back. The shop was still there, its windows glowing warmly, Eleanor's silhouette visible inside, moving between the shelves. Margaret smiled and continued walking, her hand in her pocket, fingers wrapped around the threshold stone. The weeks that followed were ordinary in their external details, work and groceries and laundry and sleep, the reliable rhythm of routine. But Margaret found herself noticing things differently now. The way morning light changed throughout October, growing more golden and then more pale as the days shortened. The particular angle of shadows on her bedroom wall at different times of day. The sound of her neighbor's door closing at 7:15 every morning. A reliable punctuation to the start of each day. She kept the threshold stone in her pocket, and on difficult days when decisions felt too heavy or the future too uncertain, she would hold it, feeling its smooth surface, its weight, its reminder that between any two things there exists a space, a possibility, a breath. You're listening to Whispering Woods, where every night brings another quiet tale. One evening in November, she walked past the street where the bookshop had been, or should have been. The bakery was still there, and the clockmaker's shop, but between them was a narrow space that might have held a door or might have just been shadow. She stood for a long time, watching, waiting, but the bookshop didn't appear. She wasn't disappointed. Eleanor had been right if she couldn't find it. That meant she didn't need it right now. And somehow that knowledge was enough, the understanding that it existed somewhere, in whatever way such places exist, waiting for the next person who would walk past at just the right moment, with just the right kind of longing, and notice the door that had been invisible until that precise instant. Margaret took up walking more deliberately after that, not with any destination, but with attention. She noticed the threshold places in her city, the park that existed between the busy downtown and the quiet residential neighborhoods, belonging fully to neither. The hour just before dawn, when night hadn't quite ended and day hadn't quite begun. The moment when summer turned to autumn, which wasn't a single day but a gradual shifting, a subtle rearrangement of light and air. She started writing down what she noticed, not stories, exactly, but observations, small moments that felt significant even if she couldn't say why. The way leaves spiraled when they fell. The pattern frost made on her car windshield one October morning, like a map to somewhere she'd never been. The sound of rain on different surfaces, tin roof, car hood, umbrella fabric, each with its own distinct voice. These notes accumulated in a journal she kept by her bed, pages filling with her, handwriting that was sometimes neat and sometimes rushed, depending on whether she was recording something at leisure or trying to catch a fleeting impression before it dissolved. She didn't share them with anyone. They weren't for sharing, they were for keeping, for remembering, for having something solid to hold on to when life felt too insubstantial or, conversely, too heavy. Winter came, as it always does, and with it the particular quiet that snow brings. Margaret found herself thinking about the garden from her grandmother's story, the one that existed between autumn and winter. She tried to imagine finding it, what it would be like to walk among frost flowers and threshold roses. But she realized she didn't need to find it, not the actual garden, anyway. She could find threshold places everywhere if she knew how to look for them. One afternoon in late December, she walked through a park she'd passed hundreds of times but never entered. Snow had fallen the night before, just enough to soften edges without obscuring shapes. The park was empty of people, but full of presence trees holding snow in their branches, a frozen pond reflecting the white sky, paths marked by animal tracks. She walked slowly, leaving her own footprints in the unmarked snow. There was something meditative about moving through the quiet, about being the first person to mark this particular path on this particular day. The air was cold but not bitter, and her breath made small clouds that dispersed almost immediately. At the park center, she found a bench that overlooked the pond. She brushed off the snow and sat, pulling her coat tighter, and took out her journal. But instead of writing, she just sat, watching the light change as afternoon moved toward evening, noticing the way shadows grew longer and bluer, the way the cold intensified as the sun dropped lower. This was its own threshold. She realized this moment between day and night, this season between autumn and full winter. This quiet place between the busy world she'd left and the warm apartment she'd returned to. She didn't need to find Eleanor's bookshop again because she'd learned what it had to teach, that thresholds existed everywhere, and learning to recognize them, to inhabit them even briefly, was its own kind of magic. She stayed until the park lights flickered on, small stars marking the paths. Then she stood, brushed snow from her coat, and walked back out into the evening. Her apartment was warm when she arrived, and she made tea the same bergamot blend Eleanor had served, which she'd found at a specialty shop, and sat by her window, watching snowfall begin again, gentle and persistent. The winter unfolded in its own time, each day slightly longer than the last, though the lengthening was so gradual as to be almost unnoticeable. Margaret fell into new rhythms, old ones slightly adjusted. She still went to work, still lived her ordinary life, but ordinary had become something different now, not less, but more. More noticed, more inhabited, more fully present to itself. She made a practice of finding threshold moments in each day, the moment between waking and getting out of bed, when dreams still lingered at the edges of consciousness. The walk from her apartment to the bus stop, a brief space of movement between inside and outside, the lunch break at work, between morning responsibilities and afternoon tasks. These weren't escapes from reality, but deeper engagements with it, ways of honoring the spaces that usually went unnoticed. One evening in February, she was walking home from work when she saw a small shop she'd never noticed before. Not the bookshop, this was different. A gallery of some kind, its windows full of paintings and photographs. But something about it reminded her of threshold books, the same quality of being exactly where it needed to be, of having always been there, even if you'd never seen it before. She went in. The space was small but didn't feel cramped, and the art on the walls ranged from landscapes to abstracts to photographs of everyday objects made extraordinary by attention and light. A man stood behind a counter, older than Margaret but not elderly, with paint stains on his sleeves and kind eyes. "Feel free to look around," he said, not in the way of someone trying to make a sale, but in the way of someone genuinely wanting to share what they loved. Margaret moved slowly through the space, pausing before each piece. There was a painting of a winter forest, all blues and grays and whites, that captured something essential about the season, its quietness, its patience, its beauty that required attention to appreciate. A photograph of a kitchen window at dawn, light just beginning to fill the space that felt like a held breath. A small watercolor of a garden in rain, colors bleeding into each other at the edges. "That one's called Between Seasons," the man said, noticing her interest in the watercolor. The artist said she painted it from memory, a garden she visited once that she's never been able to find again. Margaret's heart quickened slightly. "Does the artist visit this gallery?" "She used to," he said, "but she passed away several years ago. Her work has become quite sought after since then. People respond to something in it, though they can't always say what. A quality of being both present and distant, maybe, like memory itself." Margaret looked closer at the watercolor. In the background, barely visible, was the suggestion of a structure, a garden house or maybe a shop of some kind, its windows glowing. The longer she looked, the more details she noticed. Frost on flowers that shouldn't have frost, snow on branches that still held autumn leaves, a rose that seemed to be both blooming and fading at once. "I'd like to buy this," she said, surprising herself. The man smiled. She would have been pleased to know her work found someone who recognized it. "Would you like me to wrap it for you?" She carried the painting home carefully and spent that evening finding the perfect place to hang it on the wall opposite her bed, where she would see it first thing each morning and last thing each night. The watercolor became a touchstone, something that reminded her to look for threshold moments, to honor the spaces between things. Spring arrived eventually, as it always does, with that particular sweetness that comes from having waited for it. Margaret noticed the exact day when the air shifted from winter's cold to something milder, more forgiving. She noticed the first green shoots appearing in window boxes and tree branches, the gradual return of birds whose songs she'd forgotten she'd been missing. One morning in late March, she woke early and decided to walk instead of taking the bus to work. The city was still quiet at that hour, caught in the space between night and day. The air smelled of rain from the previous evening, and the light had that quality of newness that comes with morning and spring, soft and clear and full of possibility. She walked through familiar streets that looked different in this light, at this hour. The bakery was just opening, and she stopped in for coffee and a pastry still warm from the oven. The woman behind the counter smiled and said, "Good morning," and Margaret realized she'd been coming here long enough to be recognized, to be part of the morning routine. She continued walking, in no hurry despite the time, drinking her coffee and watching the city wake up. Shops opening, other early risers heading to work, the ordinary miracle of another day beginning. When she passed the space between the bakery and the clockmaker's shop, she didn't look for the bookshop. She knew it was there, in whatever way such places are there, and that was enough. Work was work meetings and emails and projects that needed attention. But during her lunch break, she went outside and found a bench in a small park across from her office building. She ate her sandwich and watched people pass by, each absorbed in their own lives, their own stories. She wondered what thresholds they were navigating, what between spaces they inhabited. Evening came, and with it the gentle slowing that marks the end of the workday. Margaret took the long way home, walking through neighborhoods she didn't normally visit, noticing the way different streets had different atmospheres, different qualities of light and sound and feeling. She wasn't lost, she had her phone if she needed directions, but she wasn't trying to arrive anywhere specific either. The walking itself was the point. She came upon a garden, not the garden from the story, but an actual community garden tucked between apartment buildings. Its gate was open, and she went in, following paths between raised beds that were just beginning to show signs of spring planting. The evidence in freshly turned soil and neat rows of something newly planted. There was a bench near the garden center, and she sat, pulling out her journal. The light was fading, that particular quality of dusk when colors become simultaneously richer and softer. She wrote about the day, about the walk, about the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be even though she hadn't known she was coming here. A sound made her look up. A woman had entered the garden, older than Margaret, carrying a watering can. She smiled when she saw Margaret. "I hope you don't mind," Margaret said. "I saw the gate was open." "Not at all," the woman said. "The garden's for everyone. That's what makes it a garden." She began watering the newly planted rows, moving with the ease of long practice. "Have you been here before?" "First time," Margaret admitted. "I didn't even know this was here." The best places are often like that, invisible until you're ready to see them. The woman finished her watering and sat down beside Margaret. "I'm Grace. I've been tending this garden for 20 years, watching seasons turn, watching things grow. Never gets old." They talked as the light continued to fade, about gardens and growth, about the patience required to tend living things, about the way certain places become sacred, not through declaration, but through quiet attention over time. Grace told stories of the garden's history, the people who'd come and gone, the community that had formed around this small plot of earth. "You should come back," Grace said as full darkness approached and she stood to leave. "No need to ask permission. Just come when you want to. There's always work to do if you want to help, or you can just sit and be. The garden doesn't mind either way." Margaret did come back, first once a week, then more often. She learned the names of plants and herbs, the particular needs of different growing things. She met other gardeners, other people who'd found their way here. She got her hands dirty and learned the particular satisfaction of physical work, of helping things grow. The summer passed in this way, divided between work and walking and the garden, between routine and exploration, between the life she'd built and the new dimensions she was discovering within it. The threshold stone stayed in her pocket, though she reached for it less often now. She was learning to recognize thresholds without needing a physical reminder. One afternoon in August, she was working in the garden when a girl of maybe 7 or 8 approached, watching her with the solemn curiosity of children. "What are you planting?" the girl asked. "Lavender," Margaret said, showing her the small plants. "When it grows, it will have purple flowers that smell wonderful. Do you want to help?" The girl nodded, and Margaret taught her how to dig holes the right depth, how to settle the plants gently into the soil, how to water without drowning the roots. They worked together in companionable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. "My grandma used to garden," the girl said eventually. "She told me stories about a garden that grew between seasons." "Have you heard of that?" Margaret's hands stilled in the soil. "Yes," she said softly. "I know that story. Would you like to hear it?" The girl nodded, sitting back on her heels, dirt on her hands and knees. And Margaret found herself telling the story not exactly as Eleanor had told it, not exactly as her grandmother had, but her own version, the one that had grown in her over the months since she'd first remembered it. The girl listened with complete attention, the way children do when a story catches them. When Margaret finished, the girl was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she said, "I think this garden is like that. Between things, I mean. Between all the buildings and streets. A place where different things can grow together." Margaret said, and meant it. The girl helped her finish planting the lavender, then ran off to find her mother. But she came back the next week, and the week after that, and Margaret found herself becoming to this girl what Eleanor had been to her, a keeper of stories, a guide to threshold places, someone who knew how to recognize magic in the ordinary. If your eyes are growing heavy, that's how you know you're safe here, safe in Whispering Woods. Autumn returned, as it always does, painting the world in familiar colors. The garden prepared for winter, some plants cut back, others covered to protect them from coming frost. Margaret helped with the work, learning the particular tasks of seasonal transition, the way gardens close down and open up again in their own time. One October evening, she walked past the bakery and the clockmaker's shop, and there was the bookshop again, its door and windows visible, warm light glowing from within. She stopped, considering. She could go in, see Eleanor again, explore more shelves and stories. Or she could keep walking, carrying what she'd learned with her, trusting that the bookshop would be there if and when she needed it again. She chose to keep walking, but with gratitude, with recognition of what that place had given her. The threshold stone was warm in her pocket, and the evening air smelled of autumn leaves and approaching rain, and she was exactly where she needed to be between one breath and the next, one step and another, moving through her life with attention and presence and grace. The rain began to fall, soft and steady, as Margaret turned toward home. Behind her, the bookshop's light glowed warmly, waiting for the next person who would need to find it, who would push open that particular door and discover what thresholds they'd been seeking without knowing. And in the space between raindrops, in the pause between footsteps, in the breath between day and night, the stories continued being told, and retold, remembered and reinvented, lost and found and transformed, like seasons turning, like light changing, like all things that grow in the fertile soil of attention and time. The winter that followed was gentle, as winters go. Margaret found herself marking time not by calendar dates, but by small changes. The angle of morning light through her window, the way frost patterns varied from week to week, the gradual shift in the city's rhythm as people adapted to shorter days and longer nights. She continued visiting the garden even in cold weather, though the work was different now. Mostly it involved planning, preparing, discussing with Grace and the other regular gardeners what they might plant in spring, what worked and what didn't in the previous year, what new things they wanted to try. Every garden is an experiment, Grace said one January afternoon as they sat in her apartment overlooking the garden, drinking tea and looking at seed catalogs. We make our best guesses, tend things carefully, and then wait to see what happens. Some years everything flourishes. Some years we learn through failure. Both kinds of years teach us something. Margaret had brought her journal, and she'd been writing more regularly now, not just observations but reflections, small essays about what she was learning, the way attention transformed ordinary moments into something more substantial, more meaningful. "You're becoming a chronicler," Grace observed, noticing the journal. Every garden needs someone who records not just what was planted and when, but the feeling of seasons, the small miracles, the quiet failures. Will you share what you've written? Margaret hesitated, then opened to a recent entry and read aloud. February 14th. Walked through the garden this morning after fresh snow. The beds are sleeping under their white blanket, but I could feel them dreaming underneath dreams of green shoots and flowering, of warmth returning, of the work that will resume when the earth thaws. Standing there in the quiet, I understood something about patience that I'd never quite grasped before. It's not passive waiting. It's active trust that the season will turn, that what's dormant will wake, that endings contain their own beginnings. Grace smiled, her eyes warm. That's beautiful and true. The garden would be glad to know someone's paying that kind of attention. They spent the afternoon that way, moving between seed catalogs and tea, between practical planning and philosophical reflection. Grace shared stories of gardeners who'd come before, the women and men who'd started this plot 25 years ago when the neighborhood needed green space and community, who'd fought city ordinances and raised money and slowly transformed concrete into growth. Every threshold has its guardians, Grace said. People who tend the passage from one state to another. That's what gardeners are, really guardians of, the threshold between seed and plant, between season and season. It's holy work, though we don't usually think of it that way. Margaret thought about Eleanor, about the bookshop, about all the threshold keepers she'd encountered or imagined. How many such people existed? She wondered, quietly tending the spaces between things, helping others learn to recognize and navigate transitions. As February moved toward March, Margaret noticed something shifting inside her. Not a dramatic change, but a subtle rearrangement, like furniture moved slightly in a familiar room. She was less afraid of uncertainty now, more comfortable with not knowing, more willing to inhabit questions without rushing toward answers. She was also writing more deliberately, crafting pieces that she thought of as threshold meditations, short reflections on moments of transition and in between. She hadn't shared them with anyone except Grace, wasn't sure what she'd do with them, but the writing itself felt important, a way of honoring what she was learning. One evening in early March, she received an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "From a fellow threshold keeper." Curious, she opened it. "Dear Margaret, my name is Thomas Chen. Grace gave me your email address, which I hope you don't mind. She showed me some of your garden meditations and thought we might have something in common. I run a very small press that publishes limited edition chapbooks, collections of poetry, essays, and other contemplative writing. I wondered if you might be interested in collecting your threshold pieces into a small volume. Nothing commercial, just a beautiful object that might find its way to people who need it. If you're interested, let's talk. If not, no worries, keep writing for yourself. That's always the most important audience. Best, Thomas." Margaret read the email 3 times, feeling something flutter in her chest, not quite excitement, not quite fear, but something between. She thought about Eleanor's bookshop, about stories finding the people who needed them, about the careful work of making meaning visible. She replied, "Thomas, thank you for reaching out. I'd like to talk. When would be good?" They met the following week at a cafe Grace had suggested, a quiet place with good light and better coffee. Thomas was younger than she'd expected, maybe in his early 40s, with ink-stained fingers and the slightly distracted air of someone who spent a lot of time thinking about words. "I don't take on many projects," he said after they'd ordered drinks and settled into a corner booth. "My press is tiny. I literally print books in my apartment using a letterpress I inherited from my grandfather. Each volume is hand-bound, limited edition, and takes weeks to produce. But when Grace showed me your pieces, I knew immediately they were what I'd been waiting for." He pulled out a folder containing printouts of what Margaret had written. She was surprised to see he'd designed them on the page already, considering fonts and spacing, imagining them as physical objects. "Read this one again," he said, pointing to a piece she'd written about walking to work in early morning fog. She read, "The fog erases edges, makes everything uncertain and soft. I walk through streets I know by heart but can barely see. This is how memory works sometimes, familiar territory made strange by the medium through which we perceive it. But strange doesn't mean frightening. In the fog, I notice different things. Sounds clearer without visual distraction. The particular smell of wet pavement, the way drops form on my eyelashes. Threshold weather, I call it, when the world reveals itself as more changeable, more mysterious than we usually remember." Thomas smiled. "That's it. That's exactly it. You're writing about what most people experience, but don't articulate the sense that there's something significant in the transitions, something worth attending to. I want to make a book that honors that gives people permission to slow down and notice." They talked for 2 hours about books and beauty, about the particular magic of well-made objects, about how certain books become touchstones that people carry with them for years. Thomas showed her examples of previous chapbooks he'd printed, small, elegant volumes with deckled edges and careful typography, each one clearly made with attention and love. "I can't pay much," he admitted. "This is very much a labor of love rather than profit. But what I can offer is a beautiful object and the satisfaction of knowing your words might help people find their own threshold moments." "That's more than enough," Margaret said, and meant it. Over the next few months, they worked together on the book. Margaret selected pieces, wrote new ones to fill gaps, revised and refined. Thomas designed each page carefully, considering how text and white space worked together, how the physical act of turning pages could mirror the content's focus on transition and passage. They titled it Between Breaths, Meditations on Threshold Moments, and Thomas planned to print 50 copies on creamy paper, with a soft gray cover embossed with a simple design, a doorway, a window, something opening. While the book was being printed, spring arrived in earnest. The garden burst into activity, seedlings started, beds prepared, the whole community energized by returning warmth. Margaret found herself falling into the rhythm of the season, spending evening hours and weekend mornings working alongside Grace and others, getting her hands deep in soil, learning the particular vocabulary of growing things. The girl who'd helped plant lavender the previous summer returned with new interest and new questions. Her name was Luna, and she'd been asking her mother if she could have a small plot of her own to tend. Grace happily obliged, and Margaret found herself becoming Luna's informal mentor, teaching her what she was still learning, herself patience, attention, the art of working with natural rhythms rather than against them. "My grandma died this winter," Luna told her one afternoon as they planted tomato seedlings. "I've been really sad about it. but working here helps. It makes me think about how growing things need to end before new things can start. Like how these seedlings needed last year's plants to save seeds. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Your grandma sounds wise. I bet she'd be happy knowing you understand that about gardens. She told me to look for threshold places, Luna said, arranging seedlings with careful attention. She said they're everywhere if you know how to notice them. Is this a threshold place? Yes, Margaret said softly. I think it might be one of the best ones. They worked together in companionable silence, and Margaret thought about all the ways wisdom gets passed down through stories, through shared work, through simple presence and attention. She was becoming what Eleanor had been for her, what her grandmother had been for her, and the circularity of it felt right and good. When Between Breaths was finally ready, Thomas invited Margaret to his apartment to see the finished books. They sat together in his bright living room, the letterpress massive and beautiful in one corner, and carefully lifted copies from the box where they'd been resting. The book was more beautiful than Margaret had imagined, substantial in the hand but not heavy. The gray cover soft as cloth, the pages thick with subtle texture. Opening, it was like opening something sacred, and seeing her words printed so carefully, so thoughtfully, made her emotional in ways she hadn't expected. These aren't just books, Thomas said, handling one with obvious affection. They're invitations. Invitations to pay attention, to slow down, to notice what usually goes unnoticed. That's what the best books do, they change how we see. He'd printed 60 copies instead of 50, and together they packaged them for distribution. Most would go to independent bookstores that specialized in small press and poetry. Some would go to friends and family, and one, they agreed, would go back to Threshold Books if it could be found. Grace told me about that place, Thomas said. She found it once, years ago, when she was trying to decide whether to stay in the city or move away. Said it changed her life, though she couldn't explain exactly how. I've looked for it myself, but never found it. It has a way of appearing when needed, Margaret said, thinking of Eleanor, of the rainy afternoon that felt like years ago now, rather than months. Maybe we'll walk past it someday together, and it'll be there. They decided to hold a small launch event at the garden itself, an evening reading in late May when everything was green and growing. Grace helped organize it, and word spread through the community. When the evening came, maybe 30 people gathered on benches and blankets, settling in as the light began to soften toward dusk. Margaret stood before them, with butterflies in her stomach, holding the slim book in her hands. But when she began to read, the nervousness fell away. These were her people, gardeners and neighbors, quiet observers and threshold seekers, people who'd somehow found their way to this green space and recognized it as holy ground. She read pieces about fog and rain, about morning walks and seasonal transitions, about the garden itself and what it had taught her. Between readings, Grace shared stories of the garden's history, and Luna read a poem she'd written about her grandmother's hands in soil. As the evening deepened and stars began appearing, Thomas lit candles in jars and placed them around the garden's edges, small points of light that made the space feel even more liminal, even more between. Someone brought out a guitar and played quiet songs. Someone else produced a thermos of tea and cups for sharing. It wasn't a large event or a famous one. No media covered it, no crowds gathered. But it was perfect in its smallness, its intimacy, its recognition of what mattered, community, attention, the quiet work of making meaning together. Later, after everyone had gone home and Margaret was walking back to her apartment under streetlights and stars, she held one of the books close to her chest. The evening felt like its own threshold, a passage from one phase of life to another. She was a writer now, had given voice to the things she'd been learning. But more than that, she was part of something larger. A network of people who recognized that the spaces between things mattered, who tended transitions with care. Her apartment was warm when she arrived, and she sat by her window looking out at the city night. The watercolor painting of the garden between seasons hung where it always had, and she studied it now with new appreciation. The artist had known something about thresholds, about the way certain places exist, partly in imagination and partly in reality, and that the border between those states is more permeable than we usually believe. She opened her journal and wrote, May 24th. Tonight we celebrated the book, but really we celebrated each other, the community that's formed around the garden, around the shared work of tending threshold spaces. I'm thinking about Eleanor's words from so long ago now. Some places exist outside of time, not immortal, but patient, waiting for the people who need to find them. The garden is like that. The bookshop is like that. And maybe the books we make can be like that too. Small threshold places that people carry with them, portable passages to different ways of seeing. Summer unfolded with its characteristic intensity, heat, and storms, lush growth, and sudden abundance. The garden required constant attention, and Margaret found herself there almost daily, weeding and watering, harvesting and replanting, caught up in the immediate demands of plants at their peak. Luna became a constant presence, her small plot thriving under her dedicated care. She'd taken to bringing friends sometimes, other kids from the neighborhood who were curious about growing things. Margaret and Grace would teach them, passing on what they knew, watching a new generation learn to work with soil and seed. This is how traditions continue, Grace said one afternoon, watching the children work. Not through force or requirement, but through invitation and example. They come because they see us finding satisfaction in the work, and they want that for themselves. The books began finding their readers. People would email Thomas or message Margaret through the small website he'd created, sharing how a particular piece had resonated, had helped them notice something in their own lives they'd been overlooking. Some stories were simple, someone who'd started taking a different route to work to notice small changes in neighborhood gardens. Others were more profound people who'd been going through transitions and found comfort in the validation that liminal spaces deserved attention and respect. One email came from a woman who'd bought the book at an indie bookstore in Portland. I'm writing to say thank you. I've been going through a divorce and everything feels uncertain and wrong. But your piece about the space between autumn and winter helped me understand that I'm not stuck, I'm transitioning. There's a difference. The space I'm in has its own purpose, its own lessons. I don't have to rush through it. I can learn what it has to teach. This simple shift in perspective has helped more than I can express. Margaret read the email 3 times, tears in her eyes. This was what Eleanor had done for her, what her grandmother had done. What threshold keepers did helped people recognize that. The difficult spaces weren't voids to escape, but territories to inhabit and learn from. She replied, Thank you for sharing this. You're right that transitions have their own purpose. Be patient with yourself. The season will turn when it's ready, and you'll find yourself in new territory. But the wisdom you gain in the between time will stay with you always, wishing you peace in the passage. As the seasons continued their ancient dance, Margaret settled more deeply into her life as a threshold keeper. The garden became her classroom and her sanctuary, a place where the abstract concepts she wrote about took root in soil and grew into actual flowers and vegetables. Luna and her friends brought fresh energy and curiosity, asking questions that made Margaret think about familiar things in new ways. One afternoon in September, as they harvested tomatoes together, Luna asked, "Do you think the garden remembers all the people who've worked here? Like, does the soil hold their stories?" Margaret paused, a ripe tomato warm in her palm. "I think it does, in a way. Not like we remember, with words and pictures. But every person who's tended this soil has left something of themselves, their care, their attention, the particular way they worked. That becomes part of the garden's story, even if we can't see it." Luna nodded thoughtfully. "Like how my grandma is still in this garden, even though she's gone, because she taught me, and I'm teaching these plants to grow." "Exactly like that," Margaret said, her voice soft with understanding. The autumn that year was particularly beautiful, all golden light and crisp air. Margaret spent long hours in the garden, helping with the harvest and preparing beds for winter. In the evenings, she wrote by her window, watching leaves spiral down from the trees across the street, each one following its own path to the ground. She had begun working on new pieces for a second book, though this collection felt different from the first. Where Between Breaths had been about recognizing thresholds, this new work explored what it meant to live in them intentionally, to make a home in the spaces between things rather than rushing through them toward what came next. Thomas was enthusiastic when she shared this idea with him. "That's the natural progression," he said. "First, we learn to see the thresholds. Then we learn to inhabit them. What will you call it?" "I'm not sure yet," Margaret admitted. "Something about dwelling, maybe, or lingering, the importance of not rushing." And eventually settled on dwelling in between, on the art of threshold living. Thomas began designing pages, even as Margaret was still writing, their collaboration flowing easily now that they understood each other's rhythms. Winter came again, and with it the quiet time when the garden rested beneath snow and ice. The community of gardeners contracted but didn't disappear. They met in Grace's warm apartment, planning and dreaming, keeping the garden alive in their conversations even as it slept outside. Luna had started keeping her own journal, inspired by Margaret's practice of writing down observations. She would share entries sometimes, reading them aloud in a serious voice that made the adults smile, while also marveling at the depth of her attention. "January 3rd, she read one afternoon. "The garden is sleeping, but it's not empty. Under the snow, the seeds are waiting. They're not impatient like me. They know their time will come. They trust the earth to wake them when it's ready. I want to learn that kind of trust." Grace caught Margaret's eye and smiled. The teaching was working both ways now. The children were becoming the teachers too, reminding the adults of things they'd forgotten or never quite learned. Before you drift off, remember to follow Whispering Woods for tomorrow's story. As winter deepened, Margaret found herself returning often to Eleanor's bookshop, or trying to. Some evenings she would walk past the bakery and clockmaker's shop and find only the narrow space between them. Other times the bookshop would be there, its windows glowing with welcome. She learned not to force it, not to feel disappointed on the evenings when the shop remained hidden. That was part of the lesson, too, understanding that some things come in their own time, that not everything could be summoned by wanting it. On the evenings, when the shop appeared, she would go in and sit with Eleanor, drinking tea and talking about books and gardens and the various people who'd found their way through the threshold. Eleanor always seemed pleased to see her, never surprised, as if time worked differently in the bookshop and Margaret's visits were both expected and spontaneous. "You found your work?" Eleanor observed one evening, noticing how Margaret's face had changed, how she carried herself with more certainty now. "I think so," Margaret agreed. "Or maybe the work found me. It's hard to say which." "It's always both," Eleanor said with a gentle smile. "We find what we're looking for, and it finds us looking. The threshold works both ways." They talked about the second book, about Luna and the garden, about the way certain teachings seem to spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in unexpected places. Eleanor listened with that particular quality of attention that made you feel truly heard, truly seen. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said as the evening drew to a close. She knew about threshold keeping, even if she didn't call it that. All the best gardeners do. They understand that the real work isn't just growing things, it's tending the spaces where transformation happens. Margaret left the bookshop that night with a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. The street was quiet, snow falling in soft, fat flakes that muffled sound and turned the world into something hushed and holy. She walked slowly home, in no hurry, letting the snow settle on her shoulders and hair. Spring returned, as it always does, and with it came the busiest time in the garden. Margaret threw herself into the work with enthusiasm, her hands in the soil, her mind quiet in the way that physical labor allows. Luna and her friends were there almost every day after school, their young voices and laughter bringing life to the space. The second book was nearly finished. Thomas had outdone himself with the design, creating something even more beautiful than the first volume. The cover was a deep green, embossed with a simple pattern that suggested both roots growing down and branches reaching up the threshold between earth and sky. "It's about rootedness and reaching," Thomas explained when he showed her the design, "about being grounded while also staying open to possibility. That's what your writing does. It gives people permission to be both." They launched, dwelling in between on a warm evening in June. Again at the garden, again with the community gathered on blankets and benches. This time felt different from the first launch, more relaxed, more confident, more like gathering with family than presenting work to strangers. Margaret read her favorite pieces, the ones that had surprised her with what they revealed about her own understanding. Grace shared how the threshold teachings had changed the way she worked with the garden, and Luna, now almost 9 years old, read an essay she'd written about learning patience from seeds. As darkness fell and candles were lit, someone started singing an old folk song about gardens and seasons. Others joined in, harmonizing, their voices rising into the soft summer air. Margaret sat with her back against a tree, watching faces illuminated by candlelight, and felt a profound sense of belonging. This was threshold keeping in its fullest expression, not just recognizing liminal spaces, but creating them, tending them, inviting others into them. The garden had become a threshold place, and so had the community that gathered here. They were all learning together, teaching each other, growing like the plants they tended. The summer passed in a blur of green growth and warm days, hands in soil and water on leaves. Margaret's books continued to find readers, and occasionally she would receive messages from people whose lives had been touched by her words. Each one felt like a small miracle, evidence that paying attention and sharing what she noticed really did create ripples in the world. One particularly meaningful letter came from a man in his 60s who wrote, "I'm dying. Cancer, stage 4. No treatment left to try. Your books have helped me understand that dying is its own threshold, its own passage that deserves to be crossed with attention and care. I'm not rushing toward it, but I'm not running away anymore either. I'm dwelling in this between space, noticing what it has to teach me. Thank you for that gift." Margaret read this letter to Grace, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to say to him. What wisdom could I possibly offer someone facing death?" Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "You don't need to offer wisdom. You already gave him what he needed permission to be present to his own experience, whatever it is. That's the most important gift we can give each other." Margaret wrote back to the man, a simple letter thanking him for sharing, wishing him peace in whatever time remained. She never heard from him again, but she thought of him often, wondering if he'd found what he was looking for in that final threshold. Autumn came again, marking 3 full years since Margaret had first found the bookshop, first heard Eleanor tell the story of the garden between seasons. She walked through the park where she'd first understood what thresholds were, sat on the same bench where she'd had that realization, and marveled at how much had changed. She was a writer now, a gardener, a teacher, a member of a community. She had work that mattered and people who mattered. She had learned to recognize and honor the spaces between things, and in doing so, had built a life that felt rich and full and purposeful. Luna had grown taller, more confident, more articulate about what the garden meant to her. She talked now about becoming a landscape architect, about creating more urban gardens, more threshold places where people could connect with soil and seasons and each other. "You started this," she told Margaret one afternoon as they worked side by side, planting bulbs that would bloom next spring. "No," Margaret said gently. "Grace started this garden long before I arrived. I just learned from it, like you're learning from it. We're all part of something that's bigger and older than any of us." "But you taught me to see it differently," Luna insisted. "To understand that it's not just about growing vegetables. It's about growing ourselves." Margaret smiled, touched by the girl's understanding. "Then we've taught each other. That's how it works." As winter approached, Margaret began thinking about a third book. Not right away, she wanted to let the ideas compost, to give them time to develop in the dark, quiet spaces before bringing them into light. But she could feel it forming, a collection about cycles and returns, about how thresholds weren't just passages from one thing to another, but spiral paths that brought you back to familiar places, changed by the journey. She shared this idea with Thomas over coffee one gray November afternoon. He nodded enthusiastically. Yes, that's it. The trilogy would be complete, then recognition, dwelling, and return. the full arc of threshold living. They talked about timing, about design, about how the 3 books might eventually be collected together into a set, but there was no rush. The work would unfold in its own time, at its own pace. That was one of the first lessons of threshold keeping. You couldn't force the timing. You could only prepare the ground and trust the season. Margaret walked home through streets turned silver by frost, her breath making clouds in the cold air. The city felt different now than it had 3 years ago, not because the city had changed, but because she had learned to see it differently. Every corner held potential thresholds, every moment offered opportunities for attention and presence. When she reached her apartment, she made tea and sat by her window, watching evening deepen into night. The watercolor of the garden between seasons hung in its usual place, and she studied it as she often did, always finding new details she'd somehow missed before. Tonight, she noticed something she'd never seen in the very center of the painting. So faint it was almost invisible, was the figure of a woman. She was neither young nor old, dressed in clothes that could have been from any era, and she was tending a rose that bloomed with frost and flame simultaneously. The threshold rose, Margaret realized, and the woman was the keeper. She looked closer, and with a start of recognition, saw that the keeper's face was her own. Or was it Eleanor's, or her grandmother's, or Grace's? The longer she looked, the more the face seemed to shift and change, becoming all of them and none of them, every threshold keeper who had ever tended the spaces between things. Margaret smiled and turned away from the painting, opening her journal to write. But before she could put pen to paper, she heard it a sound like wind chimes, though she had no wind chimes. She looked up and saw something impossible. Snow was falling inside her apartment, soft flakes drifting down through solid ceiling, disappearing before they touched anything. She should have been frightened, but she wasn't. This was threshold weather. She understood a moment when the boundary between real and imagined grew, thin enough to cross. She stood and held out her hand, watching snowflakes that weren't quite snowland on her palm and vanish. The watercolor on her wall began to glow softly, and for just a moment, Margaret could have sworn she smelled frost flowers and threshold roses, could have sworn she heard her grandmother's voice singing old songs to the garden. Then it passed. The snow stopped falling. The painting was just paint on paper again, but Margaret's hand still tingled where the impossible snow had touched it. She sat back down and began to write, her pen moving across the page in smooth, steady strokes. November 15th, Year 3. Tonight, I witnessed threshold weather in my own home, snow falling through the ceiling, the painting coming alive, the spaces between things growing thin enough to see through. I don't need to understand it. I just need to honor it, to remember it, to let it teach me what it wants to teach. This is what threshold keeping means, staying open to the impossible, the magical, the moments when reality reveals itself as more mysterious and more wonderful than we usually remember. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the pages of her journal were full of observations and wonderings, until the words ran out and only silence remained, the good kind of silence, the kind that feels full rather than empty. Outside, the city slept. In gardens across the neighborhood, soil dreamed of spring. In a bookshop that existed between a bakery and a clockmaker, Eleanor sat reading by lamplight, waiting for the next person who would need to find the threshold. And in the space between sleeping and waking, between one day and the next, Between what was and what would be, Margaret rested. The threshold stone was warm in her pocket. The tea had grown cold in her cup. The night deepened toward its darkest hour before beginning the long, slow turn toward dawn. And Margaret, threshold keeper, gardener of liminal spaces, dweller in between, slept peacefully, her dreams full of gardens that grew in impossible places, of books that wrote themselves, of roses that bloomed with frost and flame. Tomorrow would bring new thresholds, new passages, new spaces between things that needed tending. Luna would come to the garden with questions. Grace would share new wisdom learned from the soil. Thomas would have ideas for the third book. The seasons would continue their ancient spiral, each one teaching its lessons to anyone willing to pay attention. But for now, in this quiet hour between midnight and dawn, all was still, all was peaceful, all was exactly as it needed to be. The rain began again outside Margaret's window, soft and steady, the same rain that had fallen 3 years ago when she first found the bookshop, the rain that had accompanied so many of her threshold moments. It whispered against the glass like a lullaby, like a promise, like the voice of the garden itself telling her that she was home, she was safe, she was held by something larger and older and wiser than herself. And in the morning, when she woke to pale winter sunlight and the sound of birds calling from bare branches, she would carry all of this with her, the lessons learned, the thresholds crossed, the wisdom gained from paying attention to the spaces between things. But that was tomorrow. For now, she slept, deeply and dreamlessly, cradled in the knowledge that she had found her place in the world, that her work mattered, that the garden, all gardens, everywhere, physical and metaphorical, would continue to teach their patient lessons to anyone willing to learn. The threshold rose bloomed somewhere between seasons, neither autumn nor winter, but both at once. The bookshop waited between streets for the next seeker. And Margaret, keeper of stories, tender of liminal spaces, dweller in the beautiful, difficult, necessary territories between things, rested in the peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. The rain fell, the night held, and the world turned slowly toward morning, toward spring, toward all the thresholds yet to come.